For more on the plight of Cubans, we're now joined via Zoom by Fatima Swartz, who's the Western Cape Secretary of Friends of Cuba. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me here.
All right, so perhaps you can help us unpack a little bit. Let's start with the sanctions, actually. President Biden has looked to targeted sanctions of a few individuals to deal with what he sees as a crackdown on protests. What are your thoughts on these sanctions?
Well, I think for us as the Friends of Cuba Society, we would like to take it a bit further back to the embargo that has been in place against Cuba for the past 60 plus years. That these sanctions and, of course, the added measures that has been imposed by the Trump administration has all been about how they can asphyxiate the economy of Cubans. So it's got a long history, and of course, with COVID and everything else, things in Cuba has become extremely dire. There's no two ways about that. There's food shortages. Things are very hard for the Cubans right now. And I think, for me, it was very ironic that on the 7th of July, we ourselves went through quite a bit of protest the same time that the Cubans were going through that moment. And of course, with the protests, which is exploiting really a real situation within the country that is compounded by COVID, by the embargo, and now, of course, these extra sanctions, which rightly, as they say, will not affect the Cuban people much. But I think it is important to note that the progressive voices in the U.S. has come out, when you look at what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just said, she and their squad is calling on Biden to lift the embargo, saying it is unnecessarily cruel to impose this added plight to people, ordinary people who have no access now to food. But again, one would want to commend people who are organizing in the United States. 6 million syringes has been exported to Cuba by organizations like Code Pink and other organizations working to get at least some relief to Cuba. Now, of course, the Cuban government is suggesting that they can create a humanitarian corridor. But the Cubans are saying if we lift the embargo, then yes, we can see to ourselves, we can buy food, we can buy the military things that we want, and other people can trade with us. So I think the situation for Cubans are very dire. I think there should be solidarity with the Cuban people, and we must assist the Cuban people to be able to forge their own future in how they can see to themselves. I think the dignity of the Cuban people are at stake right now. And it's very worrying that the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, was actually calling for a military intervention. Now, Peter, that is extreme. If you're saying that people are hungry, they're taking to the streets, they need access to syringes and other medical supplies so that they can get people vaccinated. And then to talk about military intervention, it really makes us as the Friends of Cuba Society in South Africa very nervous, as I think it does all peace-loving people. So,
all right. And of course, let's move on, because time's not on our side, but let's talk a little bit about the protests and the demonstrations. You're talking about solidarity with the Cuban people. Is that still synonymous with the Cuban government?
I think it's always with the Cuban people, and I think in many ways it is very difficult for people to, in the way we articulate and see government, because we all know that the Cubans are, and this is part of why there has been the 60 years embargo, is because the Cubans are a communist country. And that in itself has always been the sore point for America in terms of it does not tolerate that people have the right to organize their society in a different way. And so for us as an organization, we've gone there during the special period. We've taken solidarity, we've taken some stuff like things for, again, medical supplies, as well as books and pens and so on when the Soviet Union collapsed. And then we work with people in the organizations that they have there. So it is with the Cuban people, but also that the system itself is very much part of the Cuban people. And I think that came out, what we're not also talking about has been those that came out in defense of the revolution, and there were millions. And of course, some people didn't think that it was correct for them too, because apparently only people who are against the government, or at least wants to express their plight and their hardship and make the government aware of that, has the right to. But we also know that following those days, millions of, and I'm still talking about millions, of Cubans came out in support of the revolution. So it is all, in terms of politics and optics and news and misinformation and fake news, very difficult to always come to a truth. But what is very real is that the Cubans are going through a very, very difficult moment. It
is a difficult moment. And in the report that we played just before we started speaking, we saw stories of journalists being arrested, arbitrary detentions, and it sounds as if the protests may actually end up being more than just about economics. Is it possible that after the Castro brothers, that maybe the Cubans want something else for themselves?
You see, what has become clear was that once Obama opened and he did create a window of opportunity, people were prospering. There was more energy in the country. There was investment in the tourist industry. There were small businesses opening, and the Cubans were very upbeat about it. Then Trump comes in and he shuts all of that down. So obviously it did bring a kind of a disappointment, if I can put it that. And then you have COVID coming in, in our own country, what impact that has had on the economy. So all of those things obviously compounded that I think as any country, people want to see progress. The young people want to live their dreams. And the Cubans are not unaware of this, as far as I'm concerned. And in the conversations that we have, they also want that for the young people and for the new generation. But they want it on their own terms, so that they can, with an unblocked Cuba, where an economic blockade is lifted, so that they can do those developments. And they were getting there, when Obama started normalizing relationships between Cuba and the U.S. And just, recently in April of this year, Senator Ron Wyden in the economic cluster put forward a bill for the U.S.-Cuba Tract Act of 2021, calling for the lifting of the blockade. So I think there's a lot of people in the U.S. that understands that the blockade needs to be lifted because it's cruel. But at the end of the day, as you know, Peter, it is about what worldview is it that we want to push. So if the yellow vests are protesting in Paris, nobody calls for bombing or anything like that. People protest in capitalist countries. It is treated differently to when people go protest in countries which are not. It is not seen as much as a a call for an overthrow of a government. So as I say, the Cubans but they are resolute, And I think what is ironic also is that we all use the same language, because now the Cubans in Miami, which is calling for the overthrow of the government, and this, of course, we know have been for years. I mean, how many attempts has been on the life made of Fidel Castro? I mean, that is almost legendary. It's movie stuff.
Why do you think the government would want to put down these protests? I mean, they are expressing themselves. They want to get their voice heard. Why would the government want to have that shut down?
Well, I think if you read the news reports, of course, of the protests, that it turned violent. And it turned violent in terms of the same way as it did here, with looting, cars being overturned, and all of that. So I think at the end of the day, no country is going to allow things to go to violence without putting in a measure of security for that. But I think we need to be, in all levels, vigilant for human rights abuses. I think it is so true. But we also need to be cautious in not falling into traps of how things are being reported and what is our news sources at the end of the day. Because when people report that there was spontaneous, and this is the word they use, spontaneous outbreaks of protest in several cities at the same time, then one always have to question how it happens at the same moment, with the same messaging, etc., and so forth and so on. So obviously things are orchestrated, but as I do not want to take away from the real issues that the protesters have. I would not for 1 minute want to diminish their pain and their suffering, because it is brought about, I think, by the cruelty of the US blockade, and we wouldn't want to. I think it would be very important for the Cuban government to act within the law, to respect the human rights, to make sure that people have a chance and an opportunity to, of course, present themselves in terms of the courts of law. I think that is very important, and I think the Cubans understand that. It is also ironic, and this has come from the people in Miami, that when the people were now protesting there in solidarity or with the protesters in the US, in Cuba, the Black Lives Matters were saying that when they were protesting in Miami, they were treated totally different to these protesters now. So again, it shows this kind of hypocrisy we have about what we support and how we deal and how we report on those who are protesting. But I think those protests are important. I think people must raise their voice. And as far as I know, that the Cuban officials and government are engaging people. And of course, we also know that there has been a number of people who is on the payroll. We don't want to go into conspiracy theories or anything like that.
All right.
But this is global politics, as you know.
Yes. Fatima, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I think this is possibly a conversation that we need to have for much longer to unpack. But thank you so much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us about the situation in Cuba. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. So that's Fatima Swartz, who's Friends of Cuba, Western Cape, sharing her thoughts with the recent protests and the sanctions that have been imposed on some individuals by the Biden administration. One does get a sense, though, perhaps, that a shift in politics is taking place in the country. What that might look like in a few months, years' time, we'll have to wait and see.